We were given the responsibility for restructuring a program that many of you are familiar with, which was propagated by Dr. Kalam when he was President of India, which is the provision of urban facilities in rural areas, the Pura concept. Basically, 7 clusters were taken in 7 different states of the country, and an attempt was made to improve the infrastructure in these clusters. About 4 to 5 crores of investment over a 3 to 4 year period in these clusters were put in. Some of these clusters did take off, particularly in Kerala, where the distinction between urban and rural, of course, is largely artificial. But at the end of the exercise, one has to say that that attempt at replicating urban infrastructure in rural areas was not a great success. Now, why wasn't it a success? There was no business plan. There was no link with economic growth opportunities. It was a largely infrastructure-oriented activity, providing roads, providing electricity, providing water supply. It was not linked with any sustainable economic activity. And there's really no ownership as far as the projects were concerned. We are taking a Gram Panchayat area, and a Gram Panchayat area, a cluster Gram Panchayat area, could be a population of anywhere between 20,000 or 25,000, and bringing a private sector in to be the anchor investor for creating the economic opportunity which will drive the growth of this town. This is a fundamental paradigm shift that we are bringing about. We are actually converging a lot of schemes of the Ministry of Urban Development and a whole host of other government departments with the objective of providing infrastructure in these areas, the responsibility for the private entrepreneur to kickstart the economic activity. Now, the service standards in these areas for infrastructure are not going to be any different than the service standards that are going to be there in urban areas, because the belief is that people are willing to pay for a good quality of service. And in fact, this is not a subsidy-oriented model. This is a payment-oriented model, because the private sector entrepreneur actually recovers his investment through pricing of urban infrastructure. Now, these are some of the type of urban amenities that we are talking about: water supply, drainage, solid waste management. Electricity, of course, is going to play a very important role. This is going to be done largely through the existing programs, but the value addition is going to come through the private sector in identifying the revenue earning projects. In some areas it could be dairying, in some areas it could be apparel, in some areas it could well be tourism, in some areas it could be non-timber forest produce, depending on the ecology of that region. Now, so what is this Pura area? What is this area that we are going to talk about? Ultimately, what we want to do is, in each of these census towns, we want to have water supply, sewerage, solid waste management, streets and drainage, and of course, increase in livelihood opportunities. It's this linkage of infrastructure and livelihood that is at the crux of this restructured program. Now, the business model, we have got private sector players. The business model really is that they are going to operate and maintain the infrastructure assets for a period of 10 years, and they're going to actually recover the cost of their investment through charging for the services. We're going to have a one-time capital grant that my ministry is going to provide. A typical project is going to cost roughly, each project is going to cost about 120 to 150 crores. The private sector partner brings in about 15 to 20 crores, and the Ministry of Rural Development puts in about 45 to 50 crores, and the balance, which is roughly about 50% of it, comes from the existing schemes which are being run by the Government of India. So if we are successful in some of these experiments, I think that we would have put a template together for integrating rural and urban development, which today has been identified as a very major gap in our planning process. That we have programs for rural development, we have programs for urban development, but we do not have any area in which deals with this gray area of between the rural and the urban. So thank you.
This whole, nettlesome question of planning for land use, how does that fit in or graft itself on in parallel with the Pura scheme?
The economic activities in the projects that we've identified so far, the 8 projects that we've identified so far, These are not land-hungry projects, first of all. So we are not yet faced that issue squarely. Implicit in the governance structure of Pura is the Gram Panchayat. I mean, is the fact that the Gram Panchayat is the anchor around which the Pura project, and it's this tripartite agreement between the private party, the government, the center or the state as the case may be, and the Gram Panchayat. So it is legitimate to expect that questions on land use are going to be determined at the Gram Panchayat level.
You mentioned about the capex, which gets taken care, the capital expenditure you would put in the infrastructure, which gets taken care of through central funding or whatever. And then you mentioned operation and maintenance. It's kind of built into it saying that this particular asset will last for 10 years or 20 years. And if it's not maintained the way it's meant to be maintained, the life of that asset shrinks to maybe 3 or 4 years. So what would be the mechanism by which you would raise this operation and maintenance costs?
You have to have an agreement with the Gram Panchayat that A, you're going to be given the responsibility for O&M for a 10-year period, and that whatever investments you're making, you will be able to recover, those investments by charging for whatever services that you are going to be providing for infrastructure. That's why out of something like 93 proposals, only 8 we are actually taking forward.
We've seen that it's only when the community is really involved that water and sanitation project or water quality, like we saw last week at the conference, they work only when there is intense community participation. So how is that going to happen? And then what about the issue of the poor? They may not be able to, get access to the services if they have to pay for it.
These are relatively better off Gram Panchayats who will be in a position to meet the costs which are going to be imposed by the entry of the private sector player. Now, the agreement of the private sector entrepreneur is with the Gram Panchayat. Okay. Now, if there is a community, a sub-community within the Gram Panchayat, which requires a subsidy, very important for water supply particularly, that would be the responsibility of the Gram Panchayat. That would not be the responsibility of the government. So it's the Gram Panchayat that determines how the framework agreement is going to be structured with the private sector player. And if, as you say, there may well be people who will not be able to pay for the water, then I suspect that there would be an element of some subvention that the Gram Panchayat will have to provide. But the payment, by the way, the way I see it, they are not going to charge for water, because that's going to be an unpopular, payment. In all these projects, the payment is going to be for electricity. Large people are willing to pay for electricity, but they're not willing to pay for water, even in these areas. But I think most of the cost recovery is going to take place through the provision of electricity and not through the supply of water.